In this video, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Jacques Derrida's book, Monolingualism of the Other. Let me just paint a picture for you, and it's partially the picture that Derrida himself paints for us. Imagine that you are a Jew who is disconnected from your Judaism. You don't speak Hebrew, and somehow you're not really part of the Jewish tradition in a meaningful sense, and yet you are a Jew in some way anyway. And you are born in Algeria. So you're a Jew born in Algeria, and around you, you hear Arabic and Berber languages spoken. And at some point, Algeria becomes a colony of France. So you're Jewish in Algeria under the rule of the French, and yet not fully Jewish, not fully Algerian, and not fully French. So this situation of having several identities, as it were, that don't seem to combine and that you're not even related to is Derrida's lens into the problem of language. Now, what is the problem of language for him? The problem of language is formulated in a paradox that he uses, which is that we never speak our own language and we only ever speak one language. So I have one language and it's not mine. Now, Derrida knows that there are quote unquote many languages. Maybe you speak French, Spanish, English, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, whatever the case may be. So from one perspective, there's this multiplicity of languages. But on the other hand, it's something that interests Derrida because, as he writes later in the book with the problem of translation, what does it mean to quote unquote say the same thing in two languages, to be able to translate from one language to another language? Does that imply that there's an underlying, never fully formulable, in its own proper way, essential language behind these different sort of sub-essential languages from which you can translate? So here's a very simple example. Let's suppose that I say to you, or somebody says to you, I love you in Russian. Then they say it to you in English, German, French. Okay, so they're saying quote unquote the same thing in all of these different languages. And what does it mean, the translatability of a message? On one hand, it seems to say that all of the languages are one in a certain sense. And on the other hand, there's the impossibility of translation. So it's actually quite complicated. I think that this, Derrida is often thought of as deliberately obscure, as too obsessed with language, as deconstructionist, postmodern French leftist type thing. But actually, this is a very insightful inquiry into something that I think is accessible and relatable. So again, imagine French is your language. Imagine it is the only language that you speak. You don't have another language. French is your language. And yet you don't feel somehow that it belongs to you. Now, it's very strange because for Derrida, he does and does not feel at home in French. And this is one of the things that I think is characteristic of Derrida's writing, and it helps to have this biographical insight, as it were, into the underlying difficulties. Because why does he and doesn't he feel like he properly belongs to the French language, or like he can dwell within the French language? So I got to explain it. First of all, there's the identity problem that we already said. To say that a language is yours, to identify with it, to have it as your mother tongue, is somehow to collapse any distance that you have between yourself and the identity of that language. So like maybe you speak German, you see yourself as a German, and your German language is in a one-to-one correspondence with your being German, somehow with your German essence or existence. And that is like no distance, no apartness. It's a total appropriation and kinship of yourself with the language. Derrida does not experience that. Okay, not only because he's a Algerian French Jew who's neither fully Algerian nor fully French nor fully Jewish, but also because he thinks it somehow belongs to language as such, that we can never be fully enveloped in it in a way that captures the totality of our identity. So, partially when he writes this, he's also suggesting why communitarianism of an ethno-national sort that is highly bound by a linguistic identity or linguistic commitment, why that doesn't fit with his model. So the idea that you can have a certain sort of fraternal, brotherly solidarity of a ethnic community bound by its language is undermined if no language is equal to itself, or if no language can be self-enclosed in the way that seems to be implied by that kind of ethno-national communitarianism. So those are some of the difficulties of this interesting book by Derrida. But also he does feel at home in the French language from another perspective, which is really amazing. I loved those passages, and maybe I'll read a few of them here for you. He says that he had his schooling in French, and in his schooling, he somehow developed this idea that you must have a certain purity of language. Don't allow yourself an accent. Don't allow yourself any misuses of language. In other words, you should be the purest, most perfect user, expositor, speaker, wielder, crafter of the language. So he says there are things that are very good here, spread over several pages. I'll give you a quick example. He says that throughout the story I am relating, despite everything I sometimes appear to profess, I concede that I have contracted a shameful but intractable intolerance. At least in French, insofar as the language is concerned, I cannot bear or admire anything other than pure French. As I do in all fields, I have never ceased calling into question the motif of purity in all its forms. The first impulse of what is called deconstruction carries it toward this critique of the phantasm or the axiom of purity, or toward the analytical decomposition of a purification that would lead back to the indecomposable simplicity of the origin. In other words, Derrida says, in all of my writings, in all these different ways, deconstruction is against the idea of purity. It's against the possibility of purity. It shows how everything is always contaminated by its other, by its opposite, and so on. And yet, I still do not dare admit this compulsive demand for a purity of language, except within the boundaries of which I can be sure. It does not inspire any judgment in me. It simply exposes me to suffering when someone who can be myself happens to fall short of it. I suffer even further when I catch myself or am caught red-handed in the act of not being perfect and pure with his French. So he says that it's kind of a obsession of his. And he says, I always surrender myself to language. So he has learned to love this pure French language, even at the same time as he denies the possibility of a purity of language. Very strange, very paradoxical, okay, very twisted in and upon itself, but not because Derrida is confused. Any difficulties that we have in understanding him, they're not a sign of his confusion. And I don't say that they're a sign of our stupidity. They're because the subject matter for Derrida is such that it is not confusing, but it folds in upon itself. And so when you speak about it, or when you try to put it into language, the language folds in and all over itself. Okay, there are other great passages that he has here about, on one hand, loving French so much that he feels like it is his language, but he won't call it his mother tongue, because again, to have a language is not to identify with its originary power, its power as the source of your origin identity. Like, I speak Russian, therefore I am Russian. Russian is my mother tongue, you know? So this very beautifully presented, in my opinion, reflection on language. Let me just give you one other passage here. He says, my attachment to the French language takes forms that I sometimes consider neurotic. I feel lost outside the French language. The other languages, which more or less clumsily I read, decode, or sometimes speak, are languages I shall never inhabit, where inhabiting begins to mean something to me, and dwelling. Not only am I lost, fallen, and condemned outside the French language, I have the feeling of honoring or serving all idioms, in a word, of writing the most and the best when I sharpen the resistance of my French, the secret purity of my French. It's a relentless resistance to translation into all languages, including another such French. So it's like so exemplary that it cannot be translated. It's one of a kind in its purity and perfection. Okay, so it's going to sound like Derrida is saying he's the greatest person ever to speak or write French, which is not the point. The point, to repeat, what is the relationship between our identity, to identify as French, as Arab, as Maghreb, as Jewish? What are these acts of identity? And how do they relate to language that we speak? And how does it confuse our understanding of identity if we have one language? Here we mean like you only speak French or you only speak English, but it's a language that you don't see as your own. It's the language of the other. For example, of the, in the case of the Algerians, of the other, of the metropole, of French, of the French, of France, of the outsider, and of the colonizer. But this is not, Derrida reminds us throughout his writing, primarily an account on the political level of, well, okay, fine, if you've never been colonized, or if you liberate yourself from the colonizer, then you have reappropriated your own language. He says, no, this is the whole difficulty. There's no such thing as your own language. There's somehow the source, the non-human, maybe divine, somehow transcendent source of language that we can hearken to. It starts to be something here kind of like the gift of speaking, the gift of writing, the gift of listening, the gift of language. And this is always a gift that we're given. We don't give it to ourselves, so we can't close off our linguistic community as autonomous, as having self-produced our linguistic origin. So he has reference to the idea of a language before and behind all other languages that we're trying to recapture. But at best, we can only reinvent it within our existing languages. So if this is something that you're trying to understand, why does Derrida think so much about language? Is it because he believes that all there is language? Like there's no such thing as a thing. There are no objects. Like if I whack you over the head with my book, that's a linguistic act of violence or something like that. No, the interesting thing here is not the idea that all there is language. The idea is rather, what is it to have a language? What is it to feel at home in a language? And what are the implications and the presuppositions about the relationship between national identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, identity as such, even the ability to say I, and the resources of a language that are given to us? Well, most of the time on this channel, I discuss Leo Strauss, Alexander Dugin, Martin Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, Plato, right-wing anti-liberalism. And you might think, Derrida, why Derrida? Derrida's on the left. Derrida's postmodern neo-Marxist. You can't avoid, if you're a thoughtful person, you can't avoid these kinds of reflections on the nature of language. How can you? Wherever you are on the political spectrum, or whatever your thoughts are, generally speaking, towards Derrida and deconstruction. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Okay, roughly and quickly, Jacques Derrida's Monolingualism of the Other, or the Prosthesis of Origin. A lot of great passages in this short book, less than 100 pages. Pick it up, give it a read, see what you think. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and see you in the next video.